Hey, it's Jason Hartman welcoming you back to another lesson as we talk about selling to owner-occupants, pride of ownership. And this lesson, you will see, the slides are a little more visual because I felt some of these concepts really needed to be visually illustrated. Now, some of this stuff may seem kind of obvious, but some not so much, so pay attention. Our learning objectives are, we're going to learn the profile of owner-occupant buyers, what they value most, and what they really just don't much care about, what they don't value. So the profile, owner-occupants value property obviously as a place to live. It is their home sweet home. And so they look at things much differently than investors. And the reason we're talking about this, by the way, is that many of you will be investing in single-family homes. And as a single-family home investor, it is very likely that you will be selling to an owner-occupant rather than to another investor. In fact, the chances are probably 90% that the buyer of your property will be an owner-occupant. And this can be a profitable thing for you. You can exploit some nice opportunities here in what I call packaging the property for the mindset and the psychology of that owner-occupant. So they place a high importance on finishes, kitchens, bathrooms, landscaping that's visually appealing. They desire properties in good neighborhoods with quality schools and low crime rates. Now, at this point, early in the lesson here, you might be saying, but Jason, don't tenants value that stuff? And I would answer, yes, you're absolutely right. Of course tenants value these things. But an owner-occupant buyer will tend to pay a lot more for these things because they view their purchases far more permanent than a tenant does. So tenants being more transient, they're not as concerned about the schools or even crime rates. It's of course important that nobody wants to live in a high crime area, unless they're a criminal and they can exploit business opportunities there maybe. But no, everybody wants a low crime neighborhood, usually good school districts, even for single people with no children, because the school districts tend to just make the area better. And areas with good schools are usually nicer areas. Not always true, but I'd say, most of the time. And those finishes too, they see it as permanence. They've got to see themselves in the home. They've got to have these emotional triggers that influence them to buy the property, to become committed to something and envision themselves living there. When I was in the traditional real estate business for many years, I saw how this psychology was so important and how the owner-occupants were so illogical about so many things. And, as a real estate agent back then, I couldn't talk logic to them. It's just a way they felt. It's been said that we as humans make decisions, even investment decisions, by the way, because I've definitely noticed this working with investors for the past 10 years, make decisions emotionally. And then after we make the decision with our emotional mind, we rationalize our decision with our rational mind. And we try to justify all the rational, logical reasons to other people why we made this decision. But it really was an emotional decision overall. So this is kind of a funny little thing I wanted to share with you. And things like this, memes like this have been around for years, but it's just the way different people see home values. So the way you see it is you see it as a nice single-family home if you own it. The buyer sees it as a little shack. The appraiser sees it as a shack that needs a lot of work. And the bank sees it as a little tiny house. The inspector sees it as a disaster. They see it as something that needs tons of work. And the tax assessor sees it as a mansion. So very different perspectives from different parties, right? So homeowners, they put more value in their property than anybody else, except the government tax assessor who wants to collect more taxes, and the buyer's looking for a good deal, and they're not going to value your property in the same way you are. So what do they value most? Well, these owner-occupants, they like curb appeal. They want things to trigger their emotions. They want to be able to visualize. This is very important. Visualize themselves living in that home. Now, remember this. I'm going to share with you. I'm going to quote myself. Isn't that weird? But I'm going to. When the seller improves the property, they shop at Walmart. When the buyer improves the property, they shop at Saks Fifth Avenue. And this can really work to your advantage. It's huge. This is huge, okay? Because you as the seller can get good deals on things that you can do to improve the property and make it appealing to these owner-occupant buyers and make extremely high rates of return and very nice profits on your property by just doing some of this packaging work for them. Remember, you're going to get good deals on the improvements, but the buyer's going to think they cost a lot more. If you do the right improvements, they will value those improvements more highly than your actual cost. So what do they value? Well, kitchens are like a centerpiece, In any home, people spend a decent amount of time in the kitchen. At any party, it seems like every party I go to, everybody ends up in the kitchen. Although there may be much nicer places in the home, people just sort of gravitate toward the kitchen. That's just the way we are. So much of home life takes place in and around the kitchen. Of course, school districts, we talked about this earlier. This is an important factor. One of our clients has kind of a funny thing. When he looks for investment properties, he was purchasing properties from us in the Indianapolis market years ago, and he would always look up on the internet and find out the ratio of free to paid school lunches at that school. And this was his way of thinking, well, how prosperous is the area, when he's doing remote long distance investing, and how poor is it? How much need is there for financial aid in that school? And it was an indicator. I wouldn't make it everything, of course, but it's kind of a funny little thing that he did. And I actually did a podcast on it, and I entitled it The Free Lunch Metric, a way that real estate investors can invest, the free lunch metric. I thought that one was kind of funny. So what do owner-occupant buyers value least? Well, they rarely understand how to compare rent versus buy. They really just don't understand this. There are all kinds of calculators on the internet. If you were to go and do a search right now, rent versus buy calculator, all sorts of different websites will come up, and they will do some calculations. What is your current rent? Well, the current rent is $2,000 per month or $1,500 per month. And, if you were to buy a property, what would your mortgage payment be? And what would the property taxes be? And what would the insurance be? And maybe there's a homeowners association. How much would that cost? And what's the rent versus buy equation? Well, when we learned in a prior lesson about rent to value ratios or RV ratios, you learned about how people do not calculate this correctly. They should be viewing that 1% target metric that I talked about as their way of valuing and comparing rent versus buy. And in the expensive home areas, you can get a very good deal as a renter. In the lower priced areas, and at the time of this recording, I would say somewhere around the $200,000 mark is where this starts to kind of fall apart. It's much better to be an owner in the lower price markets under $200,000. Almost always this is true. Of course, nothing is always true, but a lot of times. And in a high-end home, I remember a high-end property I rented that was really not super high-end, but it was a nice penthouse that I was renting for a while. And it was probably worth $1.5 million, maybe even $2 million. And I was getting a great deal on that, only paying less than $4,000 per month for it. So 1% would be $15,000 per month if the value is $1.5 million. And this is where people just don't understand how to calculate this stuff properly. So the RV ratio, or the rent to value ratio, is the right way to do the math on this. And we talked about that in a prior lesson, and I'm sure we will in some of our updates too as they come along. Taxes. There are two big tax considerations when you are a real estate investor, whether it be owner-occupied or a non-owner occupied investor type, and they are, of course, income tax deductions and property taxes. So income tax deductions, when you're a homeowner, they're different. You don't get to take that holy grail of tax write-offs known as depreciation that we talked about in a prior lesson, the non-cash write-off, the phantom write-off of depreciation. In my opinion, the best tax deduction ever. It is the income property is the most tax-favored asset in America. Homeowners, though, on the other hand, they look at this differently. They look at a property and they say, well, if I take on this mortgage, I get a tax deduction for the interest on the mortgage. I can deduct the interest. And under current law, that is the case. And there are some nuances to this, but generally speaking, mortgages up to $1 million, I believe, of course, always check with your CPA, you can deduct the interest on those as a homeowner. As an investor, the picture is different. So understand how the homeowner, the owner-occupant buyer thinks. And property taxes, of course, this will be a consideration, but it won't be a make or break deal. If a buyer is emotionally attached to a specific area and a particular home, they will, jump over high hurdles to somehow figure out a way to make it work, even if property taxes are higher in one area versus another. So it's a consideration, but again, it's not a big one. So some of the key ideas here, owner-occupants, obviously, it's all about, does it feel like home? Can they envision themselves living there? After they look at your property that is for sale, will they go home that night and start arranging the furniture in their mind and thinking and visualizing what it will be like to live there? Remember all the market fundamentals we discussed from prior lessons. I'm not going to go over those here. It would take far too long, but there are a lot of things we've discussed about cyclical and linear markets and hybrid markets and various metrics like cap rates and cash-on-cash return and rent-to-value ratios and so on and so forth. So just remember all of those fundamentals, but actually, I should have mentioned some of the more important ones, and that is the supply and demand fundamentals. Whether the supply is constricted, whether the demand is increasing or decreasing because of in-migration or out-migration, those are some very important fundamentals. And then always remember my quote, when the seller improves the property, they shop at Walmart. That's you, okay? You're going to get bargains for improving your property, but when the buyer improves the property, and what this means is if you don't do the improvements for them, they're going to think those improvements cost a lot more than they really do, because in their mind, they're buying them at Saks Fifth Avenue at the most expensive place they can shop. So a big difference in psychology. Okay, action items for this lesson. So write a selling strategy, just a quick paragraph or two, easy on this badge action, and there's a template to help you, and just upload that, take a screenshot of it, upload it, you'll have your badge, and I'll talk to you on the next lesson.